2022 began almost like a journey back in time. The international spotlight returned to the former territory of the defunct Soviet Union. There was a massive deployment of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine to welcome in 2022. And on 6th of January, the first military mission of the so-called Collective Security Treaty Organization, a kind of NATO headed by Russia, was launched in Kazakhstan. It was something like the heir to the Warsaw Pact. We are talking in this case about the deployment of some 2,500 troops under the command of this man, Russian Colonel General Andrei Serdyukov, the same guy who led the military operations to seize Crimea in 2014 and then commanded Russian forces in Syria. Also, among the troops sent to Kazakhstan were units of the 45th Brigade of the Russian Special Forces, a unit famous for its operations in the Chechen Wars, for its participation in the annexation of Crimea, and for its intervention in Syria. On this occasion, troops were sent to Kazakhstan to dilute the violent protests that broke out against the government of President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev in much of the country early in the new year. Kazakhstan, VisualPolitik fans, is one of the largest countries in the world and a major player in the global energy industry. To give you an idea, among many other resources, this country has the 12th largest oil reserves and produces more than 40% of uranium mined worldwide. But what exactly happened in Kazakhstan? Why did Russian troops have to intervene? What could explain the growing interventionism of Vladimir Putin's Russia? And what are the possible consequences? Well, let's take a look.
A plutocracy in flames.
On the 1st of January, the Kazakh government lifted price controls on LPG, a butane-propane fuel that is widely used in some regions of Kazakhstan. For example, it is the fuel used by the vast majority of the country's automobiles. And naturally, after price controls were lifted, the cost of LPG for Kazakhs increased overnight by 140%. That was the final straw. Because, you see, Kazakhstan is a country that has made immense amounts of money over the last 3 decades, thanks to all its natural resources. However, despite this, the overall standard of living is quite low. The average salary is around $570 per month, and the vast majority of workers earn much less. For years, the government of Kazakhstan has been turning the country into one of the largest plutocracies in the world. But what exactly are we talking about? Do you want proof? Well, check it out. According to KPMG, just 162 individuals control more than 55% of all the wealth in the country. And no, we're not talking about successful entrepreneurs or businessmen. Most of them are relatives, friends or allies of former leader Nursultan Nazarbayev, a status that gives them the key to the country's riches. Welcome to Kazakhstan. The situation exploded on the 2nd of January when protests broke out in Zarnozen, a small Soviet-era town near the Caspian Sea. And from there, they soon spread across much of the country as anger about the price of LPG turned to general criticism of the government. Initially, the protests were peaceful, but suddenly, and particularly in Almaty, the country's largest city, things got out of hand. The protests were joined by much more violent groups who did not hesitate in clashing with security forces. In Almaty, for example, they set fire to police cars, the city hall, they stormed police stations, warehouses, they tried to take over the airport, and even seized a lot of weapons. We are talking about a full-on war with a devastating result. On one side, more than a dozen policemen and members of the security forces lost their lives, and on the other, the casualties among the demonstrators are counted in the dozens, probably even running to the hundreds.
Kazakhstan officials say 164 are dead in protests, country now stabilized.
These official figures seem to be far from reality. And that's because the government's response was ruthless. It requested the intervention of foreign troops, authorized the security forces to shoot to kill without prior warning, decreed a state of alarm, a curfew, and ordered a house-to-house search for protesters.
The 5-story police department was a kind of torture conveyor belt. The screams could be heard from all the windows. The tortures were horrible. Aset Abishev, a participant in the anti-government protests in Almaty.
But how did it get to this point? What were the protests really about? Well, the truth is that, on this point, there are many unknowns, and no one is entirely clear about what happened. You could say that these are hypotheses for all tastes. What if things got out of hand because some local oligarchs wanted to take advantage of the protests to gain influence? What if it was really Nazarbayev's allies who were behind it all? What if it was the Kremlin's doing? What if it was foreign forces? What if everything was simply the result of the youth being tired of living badly in a country full of riches? Or perhaps a combination of several of these hypotheses? In any case, what we do know for certain is that the government of President Tokayev, supported by Russia, unleashed massive repression and a gigantic punitive operation during the days following the protests. The authorities are estimated to have arrested more than 10,000 people. The fact, together with this whole explosion situation, has left clear winners and losers. Any guesses? Well, the first clear winner was President Tokayev himself. And the thing is that, until now, this president, who came to power in 2019 after the resignation of the historical dictator Nursultan Nazarbayev, had to share power with him in a way, because although Nazarbayev formally resigned, he made sure he was appointed leader of the nation and head of the National Security Council.
Tokayev was able to put an end to the schizophrenic dual power in the country. He never became a fully empowered president because his hands were tied. Arkady Dubnov, Central Asia expert at the Carnegie Moscow Center.
However, the unrest has changed everything. Tokayev has appointed a new government, dismissed Nazarbayev as head of the National Security Council, and purged many allies and relatives of the former leader. This is, for example, the case of Kher Masimov, head of Kazakhstan's intelligence agency and one of Nazarbayev's right-hand men, who has been dismissed, arrested, and charged with treason. Another example is Samar Abish, nephew of the former leader, who was dismissed as deputy director of the country's main security service. Not only that, the president himself has also blamed the former leader in parliament for creating an oligarchic state that has enriched a few at the expense of the majority, as if he himself were free from sin.
The unrest has become a real opportunity to show Kazakhs that there can only be one owner at home. Tokayev is to this day the main political figure in the country and the one who makes the important decisions. VisualPolitik, Kazakh political scientist.
In fact, this scenario helps explain the very intervention of the Russian forces, to make it clear to all the machines of power in Kazakhstan that Tokayev is in charge, and that he has the endorsement and backing of Vladimir Putin himself. In other words, that the Russian deployment was not really carried out to stop the protests, but first and foremost, to prop up the current president.
For Tokayev, it was important to show the people, the elites in Kazakhstan, that he is the person Putin is betting on. Alexander Libman, professor of Russian and East European politics at the Free University of Berlin.
Which brings us directly to the second big winner of this storm, Vladimir Putin. You see, up until now, Kazakhstan has always tried to maintain a certain balance in its relations with Russia, China, and the United States. In fact, Nazarbayev opened the country up to the big American and European oil companies. Today, companies such as Chevron and ExxonMobil have billions and billions of dollars invested in the country. In political terms, Nazarbayev's relations with the United States were always quite good in general, but now that delicate balance has been disrupted. Tokayev has thrown himself into the arms of Moscow and Vladimir Putin, and that is something that could mark a real turning point. Kazakhstan is the second largest economy of the former Soviet republics after Russia itself, and now, for the first time, the Kremlin's influence seems almost total. As you can see, 2022 is off to a strong start for the Russian leader. On the other hand, if these are the big winners, it is clear that there are also big losers, in addition, of course, to the demonstrators themselves. Everything points to the first one being former leader Nursultan Nazarbayev and much of his entourage. The other is the West, particularly the United States, which may have lost most of its influence in the country to Moscow virtually overnight. A Moscow that lately seems to be scoring more and more wins. Listen up.
The cost of the empire.
Russia has found a niche market where its foreign policy is unbeatable, gaining influence in exchange for supporting and protecting autocratic leaders. This is something it has done in Syria, in Belarus, in Venezuela, and now in Kazakhstan, amongst other places. In this way, Putin is achieving what seemed almost impossible a few years ago, regaining much of Moscow's former influence, starting with the former Soviet states. And it is not just about supporting autocratic governments. The deployment of more than 100,000 men on the Ukrainian border makes the Kremlin's intentions really clear. Moscow is not to be trifled with. And don't think that this is just about growing political military activism, but above all, about a strategy that has been in place for years. Over the past 2 decades, Vladimir Putin has modernized the military, developed new special forces divisions, cyber warfare teams, mercenaries, and intelligence operatives, all in order to regain Moscow's old influence. Everything so that Mother Russia can become great again. Now, hold on a minute, because this whole adventure is not free. It comes at a very high price. We are talking about an economic and strategic cost. Let me explain. On the one hand, sustaining this empire is very costly. All these adventures require an ever-increasing level of spending, which means taking resources away from civil society to expand the state's influence. This is something the Russians know very well from their Soviet experience. The USSR allocated so many resources to maintain its military capacity that they ended up depleting the whole country. And yet, they still lost the Cold War. For example, according to Pentagon data, between 1974 and 1982, the Soviet Union produced 5.9 times more ballistic missiles, 2.7 times more tanks, 7.6 times more armored vehicles, twice as many aircraft, or 2.3 times more submarines. Basically, it produced more of everything, but it was of no use to them. Moscow's influence was short-lived and ended up disappearing as the Soviet economy collapsed. They never even had the feeling of being ahead of the Americans, who were leading the technological race and had an incomparably greater capacity to invest in cutting-edge equipment. And today, the story does not look much different. The excessive presence of Russia's military and foreign policy means that while Moscow is regaining its influence, the local economy and the standard of living of Russians is failing to improve. Russia's GDP, measured in dollars, peaked in 2013. Its dependence on natural resources has not been reduced, and the country's infrastructure, hospitals, and schools are in a dire state. This explains why, according to surveys conducted, for example, by the Levada Center, more than 50% of young Russians want to emigrate to another country. In other words, Russia has done exactly the opposite of what China, which has clearly prioritized the economy over the last few decades, has done. But this is not all. The Russian economy is also taking a blow from international sanctions, and new Russian incursions could end up with new sanctions that punish it even further. So the question is, what is more important? The influence of the state at a global level, or the standard of living of Russian citizens themselves? We have no doubts about it, and take note, because the Russians themselves do not seem to have any doubts either. To illustrate, in 2021, only 32% of Russians wanted to see Russia as a power, respected and feared by other countries. Only 32%. In other words, the vast majority are concerned about being able to live better. What's more, the latest Russian actions could finish with an unexpected ending: the return to an arms race that Russia is in no position to win. In other words, if the situation becomes tense, NATO and its members, particularly the countries of Eastern Europe, could decide to armor the border with record levels of military investment. In its day, this race contributed decisively to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the scenario today may not be so different. So yes, it may seem to us that today, Putin and Russia are winning a game, and they certainly hold important trump cards. For example, the energy dependence that the European Union still has on the Russian bear. The EU still relies on Russia for 41% of its natural gas consumption, and 27% of its oil. But in spite of everything, history could repeat itself. In any case, if the latest foray into Kazakhstan makes one thing clear, it is that we are facing the strongest Russia of the last 3 decades. But at this point, it's your turn. Do you think that the influence of the state should be placed above the standard of living of citizens? Do you think Russia will be able to maintain its international influence despite a limping economy that is falling further and further behind the other major powers? How do you think Western countries should deal with Putin? Leave your answers down below. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. All the best. I'll see you next time.